Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, AlbyMTG. For today's video, we'll be looking at all 5 Ravnica Allegiance mechanics that have now officially been announced. They went through this week announcing one each day, and so now it's been all 5, and so we get to go ahead and take a look at all 5 of them here in one video. So it should be a pretty fun one. If you guys haven't been keeping up to date with some of these mechanics, you guys will get to see all 5 of them here in this video. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So on Monday, they released the Spectacle mechanic, which is the Rakdos mechanic for the set. Spectacle says you may cast this spell for its spectacle cost rather than its mana cost if an opponent lost life this turn. So it's sort of like an alternative cost. You can do the spectacle cost, or you could just cast it for its regular converted mana cost. And then right now we're seeing creatures, and so with these creatures, the spectacle cost is a little bit higher, and so on them they get an additional benefit if they or if the controller pays the spectacle cost to cast instead of paying the spectacle cost to, or instead of not paying the spectacle cost and just paying the regular converted mana cost. So something like Rick's Matty Reveler here, 2 mana for a 2/2 that when it enters the battlefield you discard a card, then draw a card. Or you could pay its spectacle cost if your opponent lost life this turn, and so then you would have two generic, 1 black, and 1 red. And then if Rick's Matty Reveler's spectacle cost was paid, instead discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. So kind of like similar to Bedlam Reveler's effect of discarding your hand and then drawing 3 cards. I do like Rick's Matty Reveler. People were pointing out that this isn't just like your generic looting or generic rummage. When it enters the battlefield, you discard a card, then draw a card. So if you have nothing to discard, you can just discard nothing and then draw a card. And so it's sort of like a red Elvish Visionary if your hand is empty, which is still perfectly fine. And then if you get to cast it for its spectacle cost and draw 3 cards to refill up your hand, that's perfectly alright too. And then Raptor Demon, again, just kind of going to be your generic draft common for Rakdos, just kind of a decent little card to show off spectacle here. This one has a spectacle cost of 5 and then enters the battlefield. If its spectacle cost was paid, each opponent discards a card. So you either get a 4 mana 4/2 or you get a 5 mana 4/2 that causes your opponent to discard a card when it enters the battlefield. So some pretty interesting little cards here between Raptor Demon and Rick's Matty Reveler, and so Spectacle is your Rakdos mechanic. After that, we moved on to Orzhov, which was Tuesdays, and we saw the new mechanic Afterlife. Afterlife has the term Afterlife and then has a number after it. When this creature dies, you create a number of 1/1 white and black spirit creature tokens with flying equal to the afterlife number. So here on Tithe Taker, which is a rare that they previewed, the afterlife is 1. So when the Tithe Taker dies, you'll get to create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token. If there was something that had afterlife 4, for example, you would get to create 4 1/1 white and black spirit creature tokens when the original creature died. So it's a pretty interesting little mechanic here. I'd be pretty impressed if they managed to, give us something with afterlife higher than 4. I think 4 is pretty much where it'll max out most of the time. Like I'm expecting to see a lot of 1 and 2s because it is pretty nice seeing these like white and black spirit creature tokens having flying. It's very nice that they're evasive tokens and not just simple 1/1s that are just gonna get chump blocked for days. Sure, if your opponent has flying, then they can block the 1/1s pretty easily, but the majority of decks, so these 1/1s with flying are going to be more important than something like a 1/1 with vigilance or something like that, for example. So I do like that they're evasive. The Tithe Taker here is kind of an overrated card in my opinion. I don't think this card is going to be too great. Is helpful in certain situations, but there's other situations where it just really doesn't do much. The taxation of only 1 mana isn't really too much, so I don't think it'll be quite as good. Maybe like a sideboard card, I could definitely see that, but people are like comparing this to something like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and it's just not Thalia. But yeah, it's still an interesting card nonetheless. Tithe Taker here with the Afterlife 1 mechanic. They also showed us another common here for draft, for example, also Pauper Legal for all of these commons we're going to be talking about here. The Imperious Oligarch is a white and a black mana for a 2/1 with Vigilance and Afterlife 1, so a decent little draft common for this Afterlife Orzhov deck. Very interesting little mechanic there. I kind of like it. I think it'll be pretty sweet. I think Spectacle, you're really only going to see, for the Rakdos mechanic Spectacle, you're really only going to see the cards that have like super cheap Spectacle costs really showing up in Constructed, or that are good enough on their own without the Spectacle cost to show up in Constructed. For something like the Afterlife mechanic, I don't expect it to generate an entire deck around it unless we get some sort of a sacrifice outlet that's a good one. Right now we really don't have too much in terms of a good sacrifice outlet in Standard, but if something does emerge with like the spoiling of something along the lines of like a Nantuko Husk or a Viscera Sea or something like that, we could end up having a pretty decent little aristocrat strategy that would love the Afterlife mechanic in it. But I think what you're going to end up seeing from the Afterlife mechanic is that if it's going to show up in Constructed, the card is going to be good enough on its own, and then the Afterlife is just going to be like 1 or 2, something like that, that's just kind of like an added bonus on. The Afterlife will be like a very negligible part of the card. So maybe if they print something like I could see something like a Mythic Angel with Afterlife, right? Something like that, where if the Angel has good enough stats on its own, even without the Afterlife ability, then I could see the Angel, seeing play in Constructed, and then the Afterlife not being the main reason that the card is seeing play. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, you guys can let me know and I'll explain it a little bit better in the comment section, but I think you guys get what I mean. So that was Tuesday's mechanic, the Afterlife mechanic. That takes us to Wednesday, where we saw Simic's mechanic adapt. We got to take a look at Zagana Utopian Speaker here. 4 mana for a 4/4 when it enters the battlefield. If you control another creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, you draw a card. And then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample. And then it also has the adapt mechanic, which will be Simic's mechanic. So for 6 mana, 4 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue, it has adapt 4. If this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So similar to the Aftermath mechanic that we saw where it has Afterlife 1 or Afterlife another number, whatever that number is, that's how many spirit tokens you're going to make, and for the adapt mechanic, whatever that number is, that's how many +1/+1 counters you're going to put on the creature. One of the things to keep in mind is that this card is not necessarily this card. This mechanic is definitely one of those ones where it's going to be great for limited because it's a mana sink, but in constructed, it's most likely not going to show up. There's already some like reasonable mana sinks in standard with things like Treasure Map to put that extra mana in to just like do some scrying and things like that, activating like Search for Azcanta, those sort of things. And then in the kind of deck that wants something like a Zagana, like the green-blue Merfolk deck, you're really just trying to curve out, and so most of the time you're hoping to not have 6 lands out to even activate this adaptability. You're hoping to just run them over with cheaper, smaller creatures. So I don't think the adapt mechanic is something that's going to show up too much in constructed, but in limited the adapt mechanic is going to be very good. You can activate this at instant speed, which is great. The ability to just have an onboard trick is something that a lot of people will have to pay attention to during their limited matches here for Ravnica Allegiance, and so I do like that you have the ability to do this at instant speed too, because it works really well with the blue cards, because blue allows you to have things at instant speed like counter spells or something like that. So you could pretend like you have a counter spell in your hand, maybe they don't cast something that turn, and so then you like they know you have the counterspell, they don't cast something so that you can't use the counterspell, and then you just use that extra mana to activate the adapt mechanic. So I think it's pretty sweet. The other card that they did reveal with the adapt mechanic, again just for draft, is the Areomunculus, which is 3 mana for a 2/3 flyer, and then it has adapt 1 for 4 mana. Again, I think this is just kind of like your generic card here for a draft that really fits what the mechanic and the colors are trying to do. So this reminds me pretty similarly of something like Sky Knight Legionnaire, where that kind of card fit perfectly in the Boros deck. I think Areomunculus fits perfect for what the Simic deck is trying to do. It has the mechanic on it with Adapt, it has a little bit of evasion on it, and then it's also just, a pretty decent little card here. Like a Windrake with 1 extra toughness is already fine on its own, but then having the Adapt mechanic is pretty sweet as well. So I think this is going to be a pretty decent common if you end up in Simic. And then that takes us on to Gruul, which is the Riot mechanic. This was shown to us on Thursday. The rare they showed us was Gruul Spellbreaker, which is 1 colorless, 1 red, and 1 green for a 3/3 with trample, and as long as it's your turn, you and Gruul Spellbreaker have hexproof. And then it also has the Riot mechanic, which says this creature enters the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter or haste. The best way that I saw this described was you either get to pick on your on your Gruul creatures, you either get to pick whether you want a green creature or whether you want a red creature. The green creature would be the 3 mana 4/4 with trample and hexproof as long as it's your turn, and then the red creature would be a 3/3 with trample and haste that has hexproof as long as it's your turn. So Spellbreaker I think is pretty good. I think Spellbreaker honestly could be fine and constructed. The 3-drop slot is a little bit competitive right now with other cards, so maybe not. It's also kind of like a question whether Gruul is going to give us enough things that we would want to play something that wasn't just like Boros, for example. So it'll be interesting to see where that ends up in terms of what other cards get printed, possibly with the Riot mechanic on it as well. So this is a pretty decent rare here if you're looking to play Gruul. And then another card they showed us with the Riot mechanic here was the Frenzied Erynx, which is 4 mana for a 3/3, and then it has Riot again. So you either get a 4/4 for 4 with Trample and this pump ability to give it +3/+0 for 6 mana, or you could have a 4 mana 3/3 with Trample and Haste that has this ability on it. So the Haste makes it really good the turn that you play it. The +1/+1 counter makes it better for if you're trying to, maybe go a little bit longer in the game. So you really have the opportunity of, if you want to, bring on the pressure, make things really aggressive, you can choose the Haste from the Riot. If you need to just kind of like sit back a little bit, maybe build up a bigger board, then using the Riot mechanic to get the +1/+1 counters is probably what you're looking for instead. So again, just a decent little draft coming here with the Frenzied Erynx, and I think it's something that you'll be playing if you end up in the Gruul colors. And then this takes us on to Fridays, which is today. They showed us the Azorius mechanic, which is Addendum. Addendum here you can see on Sphinx's Insight. You draw 2 cards for 4 mana, and it's an instant. And then it has Addendum, which says, if you cast this spell during your main phase, you gain 2 life. So Addendum is for casting an instant speed, or for casting the spell during your main phase, you get some sort of additional bonus added on to it. So for the Sphinx's Insight, it can either be a 4 mana draw 2 at instant speed, or you could play it more as a sorcery because it would be at your main phase. So then it would be a 4 mana draw 2 cards, gain 2 life at sorcery speed. So you really get to end up choosing depending on how good the Addendum is for you in the certain situation, you can choose whether you want to just cast it in your main phase or whether you want to cast it at the instant speed. So instant speed is nice because it allows you to mess up things during combat, allows you to do things in the end of your opponent's turn, but then the sorcery speed is going to be nice because you'll be able to get this extra Addendum benefit. This one kind of like a little bit of a negligible, sort of not very important Addendum card, this one just kind of being more basic, but when we come down here to look at the first mythic that was revealed from the set, which is Emergency Powers, you can see a pretty strong Addendum card here. 7 mana for an instant. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards, and then you exile Emergency Powers. But then it has the Addendum mechanic, so if you wanted to play it at sorcery speed instead of instant speed, then you would do that first part. Each player would shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library, draw 7 cards, and you would exile Emergency Powers. But then you would also get to put a permanent card with converted mana cost 7 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. So when we think about the Azorius colors, this could be something like Azor the Lawbringer, something like your Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, something along those lines. I'm sure we're going to see plenty more good Azorius cards shown off here. Thinking back to like some older sets, Nezahal is also 7 mana. I think Chromium is 7 mana too if you're playing Esper, so you could really go all in on these, hoping to get the Addendum to just put a massive creature into play after refilling up your hand to back to 7 cards with the Emergency Power. So it's a pretty neat little card here. So those are all of the mechanics here. They did also show us one additional card here today, Incubation and Incongruity, just to show us that they have the split cards back. In Guilds of Ravnica, there was one uncommon split card and one rare split card for each different guild, and so I'm assuming they're going to do the same here because it says the 2 cycles of split cards, so I'm assuming they're going to be coming back in both one uncommon card and one rare card for each color. The uncommon Simic one here is Incubation and Incongruity, so for a hybrid green-blue, so you could either pay 1 blue mana or 1 green mana, you get a sorcery that says, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I think the main card that this is really competing with would be something like Adventurous Impulse. Adventurous Impulse allows you to hit a land, but only allows you to look at the top 3. So it'll be interesting to see what decks end up playing Adventurous Impulse, where they value the lands a little bit more. They value the ability to find the lands a little bit more, versus somebody who's going to play Incubation, which just values finding the creature. More important, getting to see the additional cards and then choosing a better creature from them because they have more options. Incongruity here is something we've already seen in the past in previous cards like Rapid Hybridization, Pongify, Beast Within, those sort of effects. One generic, a green, and a blue for an instant. Exile target creature. That creature's controller creates a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token. So this is nice because it's instant speed, allowing you to interact with combat. So if they try to, maybe put a pump spell or some sort of an enchantment on one of their creatures, you can go ahead and destroy it in response. They will get a 3/3, but then they don't get this massive creature with, an enchantment or a pump spell added onto it. You also have the ability to, if you just have, a random 1/1 sitting around and you need to push through the last points of damage by having a bigger creature, you can turn that 1/1 into a 3/3 by using your incongruity. So it is kind of an interesting card, and I like the fact that they made it instant speed here too. I personally would have thought they would have made it sorcery speed since this is only an uncommon, but honestly, this card seems pretty solid to me for definitely for draft because it removes your opponent's bomb creature and replaces it with just a 3/3 token. It's also an exile effect, which is really important too for some of the cards that can bring things back from the graveyard. Things like the Eldest Reborn, where they can return a creature from the graveyard. Things like the Phoenix, why can I not think of it? Arclight Phoenix. That card cares about being in the graveyard, and so you have the ability to exile it instead. Something else like Golgari Finebroker, which allows you to bring back a creature. You have Memorial to Folly, which lets you bring back creatures from your graveyard. So there's a lot happening in the graveyard as well, and so the exile effect here on Incongruity is pretty important here. So this has been the 5 mechanics for Ravnica Allegiance, as well as one additional spoiler card here with Incubation Incongruity. I'm pretty excited for this set. I think it's going to be a good one, and yeah, it should be a pretty solid set. Let me know what card we talked about here in this video that you enjoyed the most. I think also let me know what card or what mechanic you enjoyed the most as well. I think in terms of mechanic, I think I just like the riot mechanic the most from Gruul. I really enjoyed playing the aggressive decks in Guilds of Ravnica, and so I think I'm going to end up playing quite a few aggressive decks here in Ravnica Allegiance as well. So I think personally for me, riot is my favorite mechanic, but I also do like Afterlife as well. I'm definitely going to try and make Afterlife work somehow with some sort of an aristocrat style strategy at some point in this next standard season. So should be a lot of fun playing this set. I look forward to it. Hopefully you guys do as well. If you guys did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like on it, as well as subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Magic the Gathering content like this in the future, and I'll see you guys here next time for another Magic the Gathering video. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video where we talked about the 5 mechanics for Ravnica Allegiance. At the end of all of my videos, I love to give a huge shout out and thank you to my patrons over on the Patreon page. I really appreciate the support that they give me, so huge shout out and thank you to BadWolfMTG, Jason, Daniel, Jeremy, Rodrigo, Down Under MTG, and Jayathy Swerin for supporting me over on the Patreon page. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I appreciate you as well just for watching this video and making it all the way to the end. Really means a lot to me, and I hope you enjoyed.